How to sew a rolled hem without using a special foot. I have 4-way stretch fabric. This can also be done with wool. Knit fabric does not fray. However, after time, it does kind of roll a little bit onto itself naturally. So when we do a rolled hem on knit fabric, I would recommend making the hem just a little bit wider than you would if you were using a tiny little rolled hem foot. Because if you do a tiny little rolled hem, you're kind of just basically wasting your time because the fabric's going to want to roll anyways naturally. So you might as well make that a little bit bigger on knit fabric. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to put the wrong side of the fabric is going to be facing up. I have a stretch needle. It is very important when working with knit fabrics you use a stretchy needle. If you're working with wovens, a universal needle should be just fine. I'm also going to have the computer set to a large zigzag for this particular project because it is a stretch knit. If it was a wool for clothing, I would recommend using a skinnier zigzag stitch, one of these stitches. It's a lot skinnier. But since I'm using a 4-way knit stretch, I'm going to use a zigzag stitch that is larger. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to put our fabric down. We're going to fold it one time. Now, if you wanted to, you could just stitch here. That could be fine. But if you have woven fabric, this edge right here is going to fray over time. And I don't want to do that. I want my fabric to appear very finished and crisp and ready to go. So to avoid that, I will flip it a second time. Notice how I've done it quite wide over here. This is so that way it'll have a nice, pretty finished edge, and when I stretch the fabric, it's really thick and noticeable, and it just gives it a better luxurious feeling on the garment. If you are doing this and you are not making clothing or items and you were quilting and you were doing some specialized applique techniques, you can use a straight stitch or a blanket stitch, but I think that a zigzag stitch for most applications, especially when it comes to items and clothing, is the most appropriate way to go about doing this. If you are using a rolled hem foot, you should use a straight stitch because on those rolled hem feet, that's all the plate's going to allow you. The foot is going to allow you just a little hole to go through. This is why sometimes it's good to not use the foot. Right now I have a universal foot on my machine. They call it a J foot. Especially make sure you have a stretch knit needle. Now notice how when I put the fabric in, I'm not all the way here on the edge. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give myself a little bit more room and then set my foot down. The reason why I do this is right here, it gives the feed dogs a little bit more of an area to go through so that way they can really grip onto the fabric and pull it through. Knit fabric is a little harder to sew with than woven fabric because you don't want to have to pucker and flower. Now, when I'm doing this, I am not going to be pulling. There is no pulling on this fabric. I want to let the feed dogs do their job. So my hands are here only as guiding the fabric. I'm going to finger press, which means I'm going to use my finger and press down the fabric, make it nice and rectangular. And then I'm just going to put my foot on the pedal, and I have a medium speed. I'm going to go ahead and just let the fabric feed itself. Now, when using a knit fabric, do not use the back stitch because you're going to just get like a nest down here and it's going to shove the fabric into the machine. And that's going to be like such a headache to have to pull out and cut. And you might cut your fabric when cutting the stitches. That's also why I choose to use a larger stitch length when it comes to 4-way stitch knit stretch fabric, because then it's easier to seam rip, and then it's easier for the machine to not get caught up on itself and shove the fabric into the machine. If that does, as soon as you notice it, stop. Do not continue, because by continuing, all you're doing is making the problem worse and worse, and it's going to be more of a problem to fix it. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to just gently guide it and allow the machine to feed it through. Now look what's happening right here. The fabric started to want to bunch in between the middle part of the foot. So what am I going to do? I'm going to lift up my foot, wiggle it a little bit, and set the foot down, and it flattens out. I'm going to continue a little bit more, and it keeps wanting to bunch. So I only go a little bit at a time, and I keep flattening. Now what I'm going to do is, I know you're not supposed to stretch the fabric at all one way or the other, but since this is extreme stretch knit fabric, I do have to help it out a little bit. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to constantly keep adjusting to make sure this is flat. And then on the back here with this side, I'm going to do a gentle pulling just to help those feed dogs out a little bit. Make sure your feed dogs are up with knit fabric. Oops. My thread was cut. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to cut the bottom thread off, and I have to rethread my machine. This happens every once in a while, especially when you keep having to fuss with the foot and everything and readjust. These things happen. Now every machine is slightly different, but they all, for the most part, work the same way. So when rethreading your machine, make sure that you follow the numbers and the patterns. They're going to have a bunch of lines with arrows. Follow those arrows for your machine, and it'll be fine. Like, you'll be able to figure it out. They made it really common sensey. Even machines that were built after the 70s. It's very simple though. Just follow the pattern on the way that the thread goes. I have an automatic threader on my machine, which is still very much a hassle. But it does beat the alternative of having to stare at the needle and just bend over and figure it out, and it'll take me like 20 minutes to thread it. So even though it is a little bit of an issue to thread it, it's easier than the alternative of just having to figure it out. Okay, so now I have a little bit of a thread tail here. If you're a newbie, I recommend cutting this, because sometimes these thread tails that are left behind can get caught up in the machine and in the needle again, and that could make a whole other problem. Also too, if you notice right here, I am prioritizing my stitch on the left side. You could, if you had a really large stitch, go down the middle if you want. I would recommend staying away from the right side. It's really personal preference and the look that you're going for. All right, I changed my needle so that way it's more in the middle. Just as long as it's a zigzag stitch, it should be fine. Now I'm pulling a little bit with my left hand just to try to feed it through. I'm going slowly. Now I'm stopping. Notice I didn't pick up the foot. I'm just going to finger press a little bit to make sure that we're on the right track, that we're going good. Sewing is not a sprint. It's a journey you should love while you're doing it. Take a moment to just appreciate what you're doing and having a good time with it. The more precise that you are while sewing, the less times you're going to have to be seam ripping. So in theory, you are then sewing faster, even though you are sewing and going about the process slower, because you don't have to seam rip later and fix boo-boos. You're actually going faster. I've timed myself before, and it really does make a difference. So make sure that you're doing it correct the first time. It has happened to me where I accidentally hemmed the wrong line. That happens. Then you gotta seam rip it all out. I'm only going about 1 or 2 inches, and then I'm finger pressing over again. Now this process is way simpler when using a woven fabric. Oh, look what happened. See, I pulled too much, too fast, and look at this. Look at all that thread. How do we fix it now that it's over threaded itself? Well, we're going to pull it out. I'm going to come over here and cut these guys. Cut them loose. And then all we're going to have to do is go through and see if we could figure out what the bad thread is. Yep, pull that thread out, get it away from the machine. There we go. In this process, my needle has become unthreaded. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and fix it. Now, when working with woven fabrics, I don't usually have this many issues when I'm sewing. It doesn't snag as much. The machine's able to go through better. Make sure that when you use your automatic needle threader that your needle is as high as it can go. Otherwise, if your needle isn't all the way high and you're using the threader, the mechanics of the math of the way the machine is, it's not going to line up. So then it's going to be like a whole thing, and it will never go through the thread, and the pin will never go through the eye of the needle. I use a little bit of a pin to pull it through. Once the thread has gone through the needle, I use that pin to pull the rest out. It doesn't say to do that on the instructions, but after utilizing my machine for so long, I've just come to the conclusion, instead of me trying to pull it with my fingers, which is what the manual is telling me to do, it's just easier to use a pin and pull it through once it's already went to the other side. All right, so let's start again. Remember, we're going to fold once and then fold twice. We're going to finger press and make sure it's pretty wide. Also, use your machines as guides for sight. Now, you can use one of these feet. I use this guy quite frequently, really, and that's a seam guide. But since I'm doing such a small section, and if I were to use this guy right now, what's going to happen is it's going to press down on the fabric too much. And with four-way stitch, you don't want any pulling, because if you did, you would get a lattice hem, which can be totally cute on hems like bottom of dresses and stuff like that. But since this is going to be a hemline for a sleeveless dress, I don't want it to be latticey and I don't want it to be wavy. So that's why I'm taking care not to pull on both sides. However, to get it through the machine, I'm going to have to do a slight tug. So it will lattice a little bit, which it can be very unflattering when it comes to the sleeve holes. Don't push too hard. Allow the feed dogs to work. So when I'm pulling, it's very gentle, because remember how I had all my thread go through? I was pulling too hard, too fast. So you kind of just ever so slightly help those feed dogs out. Now, if you're doing wovens, you don't need to do any of this pulling at all whatsoever. Okay, now it's starting to bunch and not be lined anymore. So I'm going to lift up my foot and reset it down. It's going to flatten out that area. Got to finger press again, readjust. Remember, we're doing this once, not 5 times. So we're going to do it right the first time. Also, too, by folding twice and encasing that edge of the seam, it looks finished on both the right and the left side of the seam. If we were just to do the one, it would fray on this side, especially if it was a woven material. It'll fray really badly. Now, if this is your first time doing a rolled hem, I strongly recommend practicing a whole bunch on woven fabric first. And then after you feel very confident with this technique, then move to a moderate stitch, and then eventually you could do like a jersey knit like what I'm doing right now. But you got to really work up to it. I've been sewing for many years, and I still, like you saw, have many boo-boos. Boo-boos happen all the time for me. Especially, see, look at what I was talking about when you pull. See how it has gone, the hem is wavy. I do not want that, but that's what I could get. I mean, I do have a stretch needle in there. I'm using the appropriate foot. This is just how it is, right? Stretch knit fabric is extremely hard to sew with. Now, one thing you can do that could help is if I would have had some interfacing and I laid it down, or maybe some paper and I was stitching over it, fusible, non-fusible, just having that extra interfacing would have helped me on this situation to be able to sew a little bit nicer. But I am in the process of camping right now, and all of my interfacing is at my house, and the nearest store is about an hour and a half away. So I'm working with what I got. But this is what happens when you pull. It's not super bad because I only pulled on the one side. Had I have pulled like right here, see this? This is what it looks like if you pull on both sides. It's extra wavy, which could be cute. The hem of a dress at the bottom or like some sleeves, this could be a really cute pattern. Let's see if we stretch that out, then what happens? It's going to retain its waviness, but because we used a zigzag stitch, it's still going to allow the fabric to be able to stretch. Now, it's not going to stretch as much there as it will here. This, see how there's a lot of stretch there, and on the hemline, not as much stretch. That's because of the thread is kind of keeping it tight. But that's about it. Yeah, if you're practicing, I would recommend using a thread that does not match your fabric, so that way you can hide it. Or you could use it, or excuse me, if you're practicing, use a thread that doesn't match your fabric so you can see, because look at the zigzags, they're fun. We want to make sure we're doing even, because sometimes we can get into areas like right here where I had the boo-boo and the thread doesn't look pretty. But because I use black fabric, you really have to stare at it to see that there's a boo-boo right there. Yep, there's another boo-boo right here. See how the fabric is bunched up a little bit? I needed to take a moment, and I did not at that time, to readjust, and that's what happens. But this works, honestly. What I'm trying to demonstrate here is I've been doing this for about 20 years, and I still have boo-boos, okay? When you go to the mall and you buy those clothing, those come from factories of people who do the same thing over and over again for 3 months on the same machine doing the same process. So they're really good at their one little thing that they do, and then they pass on to the next person who is a specialist at their thing. It's okay to have boo-boos and not have to be a perfectionist at everything. As long as your outfit comes out comfortable and you feel that you look good in it and you do look good, it's fine. Just let it be. It's all these little boo-boos. You don't have to seam rip every little thing and be like, oh geez, for like 30 minutes when all you needed was 5 minutes of like, okay, let's do it. And if you do need to seam rip, go ahead and do that, because you can save yourself some time and effort and don't waste your fabric. But if you have boo-boos, sometimes these things happen and it's okay. Thanks for watching. Push the purple flower to subscribe and you can watch all kinds of awesome videos.